Hello friends, I am Chevee. Welcome to my shed. How are you today? How's life in your world? How's things where you are? I hope it's fantastic. Everything here is great. And today we're going to talk about some books. Specifically, we're talking about the Mistborn Era 2 cycle, set of books from Brandon Sanderson. Because tomorrow, November the 15th, the fourth and final book of this era comes out. So, I read the last two books. I found these like in discount shops or on the discount shelves in bookstores for like $5 or something like that. So I picked them all up, and that's not technically true. I think I found this one at a shop, and I had just read, or no, that's not true either. I purchased this one. I read Mistborn, the original trilogy, and then found out that there was a standalone set. Oh yeah, there's a receipt. There was a standalone set some years after the Mistborn stuff, and so I was able to find this one last year, maybe even 2 years ago. This receipt says 2020. So I read this like 2 years ago. Standalone book, works really, really well. It is set like 300-ish years after the previous trilogy, and in this setting there are guns and trains and cowboys and that sort of stuff. So it's like a Western kind of setting, early Industrial Revolution, like 1900s Industrial Revolution setting. And I thought it was really good. And then I discovered that this was a whole trilogy. I kind of knew it was. Then I found these two on the discount shelf. That's what happened. So what ends up happening is, from what I understand, from what I gather, Brandon was not planning on writing these. These were not originally part of his Cosmere plan. But he wrote this Alloy of Law as a standalone kind of just Mistborn novel. And then he liked these characters so much, he ended up coming up with an idea for them. And that's how we've got this current trilogy. Well, tomorrow it'll be current. So I've had these for a while, read this one a couple years ago, held off on reading these. Decided I was going to wait until the third book came out, or the fourth book came out, before I read the trilogy. And I'm glad I did, because if you read a lot of Brandon's works, the thing about these books is they are tied into a much larger story that he calls the Cosmere. And he had originally, I don't know what his current plan is, but originally he had said that he had outlines for 36 books that make up this epic tale. The Mistborn cycle is part of that. Then the Stormlight archives are part of that. And then some of the standalones, like Elantris, are part of that. And a few other White Sands, and there's a couple of other trilogies that'll be a part of that, that tell this much larger story about this, system, this system where there's multiple systems and planets and world hoppers and all that sort of stuff. So this series of books just kind of happened. They weren't really intended to be a part of it. And the reason that I'm saying all of that I'm glad I waited to read these, is because there's a whole lot of through threads that if you want to catch them, you kind of have to read them as a clump. Or you have to do a whole lot of reading on like coppermine.net, which I do. I have read a lot of that. So I'm glad I held off, because he teases a whole lot out in these two books. This one, not so much. This one's, like I said, kind of a standalone story. And it's a neat little romp. It's a very good book. I very much enjoyed this book, but it doesn't really... There's some threads in there, but they're really minuscule. This, on the other hand, these two books are much more in tow with the rest of the books of the Cosmere. And I would suggest, if you have not read Mistborn and you want to read these, then just read these. if you have read The Mistborn and you want to read these, you should first read A Secret History. This is a story that's like a novella-sized story that was published as part of a compilation. This is a UK edition. There's never been a printed version in the US that I'm aware of. I bought the UK edition because I like to have physical books. This clears up a whole lot of the like, wait a minute, because when you're reading these, there's some details about how the world was formed and that sort of stuff post the previous trilogy that don't make a whole lot of sense. And there's also quite a bit of the previous trilogy that don't make a whole lot of sense until you read this. Once you read this, you'll go, oh, that makes a lot more sense. So this is kind of the key to unlocking how this all ties together in the larger Cosmere. All right, that being said, these two books I just read in the past week. And tomorrow I will be getting the third book and I will read it. I gotta say, a bit something odd happened for me when reading these two books. So, Shadows of Self is the first book of the trilogy. Again, Alloy of Law is a standalone book. This is a trilogy with a prequel. Shadows of Self. I actually struggled to read this book. I struggled to stay interested in it. I said through the whole time I was reading this book in my head, I was, consciously thinking about how I'm going to talk about this. I didn't understand what the stakes were in this book for the entire book. Like, I don't really know why people are doing what they're doing, other than the characters in this series, Wax and Wayne, are kind of a Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, with their personalities somewhat flipped, where, the Watson character in these books is much more unhinged and weird and does all the strange oddities type stuff. So other than those characters being insatiably curious, a lot of the motivations in this book don't make a whole lot of sense. There's not much stakes that make a whole lot of sense. You're just kind of like reading a few pages that just, however many pages this is, say 400 and something, maybe 400 pages-ish. You're reading 400 pages of, just a slice of life kind of thing. Like, here's some people living in this world and they're doing a thing, and you're like, cool, why are they doing it? It doesn't really matter. They're just doing it. You go, okay. And there's not a lot of character development in this book. I had a really hard time reading this book and staying engaged. I found myself just being pulled out of it constantly. Like, I don't really know why this story exists. And then comes book 2. And book 2 really takes everything to a completely different level. Very, very few times in my life have I read a trilogy of books where book 2 has been the standout. Now, I can't claim that yet for this trilogy because the next book isn't out yet. But I can tell you that this book makes what I had to read in this book worth it. What I chose to read in this book was great, and there's a few key points that tie together, but not much. But this makes that first book worth it. That first book is entirely set up, and I mean that like wholeheartedly. There is no payoff in that book whatsoever. The payoff for that book happens in this book, right? Which is a very strange thing for me. Again, book 2s traditionally for me have been, even book 2 of the original Mistborn, I criticized it. It was just boring. It's just so much just, all right, we got to build to the end. Whereas this thing builds to the end of these two books. It builds up, a conclusion for these two books, and then opens up a whole new can of worms, so that the next book is going to be its own completely different thing. At least I think so. And I'm really excited about that, because this was a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it very much. I had a hard time putting it down. If you've read much Sanderson, or if you know a little bit about him, or maybe you don't, so let me tell you a little bit about him. He's been writing forever. He wrote something like 13 books before he published his first book. And he seems to have taken a bit of writing advice to heart. And he's a professor. He teaches creative writing at Brigham Young. And one of the things he constantly talks about is setup and payoff, setup and payoff, setup and payoff. That's his entire formula, is setup and payoff. And so he will use that to dangle things in front of you for this entire series and wrap them all up by the end. And there's a whole lot of dangling here. Not so much in here. Like I said, this didn't have a lot of that. I think that's the thing that made this book miss for me, was that there wasn't a whole lot of setup and payoff. When you get into the Bands of Mourning, there's so much more of it, right? And what I mean by that is not necessarily like setting up a large scale world problem, but even just simple things. He will set something up. For instance, I won't spoil it too much, but there's a scene near the end of this book when a character is doing something slightly off. Is the only way I could put it. Like, she's got her notebook out and she's writing on the back of her notebook. Not she's just writing on her notebook, right? And one of the other characters sees it. One of the other characters notes that she's writing on her book. And that character has an internal, like, why is she writing on the back of her notebook? That's weird. And then a chapter later, there's a payoff for that moment. That's the kind of stuff he does. And he didn't do a whole lot of that. At least I didn't catch it if he did in Shadows of Self. Like, he just kind of told a story, like a normal writer would. Here's a story and I'm going to tell it to you. And this, it was very much more the Sanderson way. Let me set up a bunch of little things and then make them pay off. Let me set up a big thing and make it pay off. Let me set up a mediocre thing and make it pay off. And he does that consistently in a way that keeps you wanting to go. Like, you don't want to stop until you find the payoff for that kind of offhanded comment. You know, when the character notices the other character writing on the back of her notebook, as a human, I thought that's a kind of a weird thought to have. Like that, like what is the point of that? I don't think anybody would have in the real world noticed or even thought it was weird. But in this world, these characters, it made sense. And then the payoff happens, and you go, oh, yeah, that's very cool. Very well done. This book has a lot of that, in really great ways, really fun ways. It really works well. And I think, the plan, from what I understand, is that there's 2 more trilogies planned in the Mistborn world on Scadrial, or however you say it. The next one is going to be like 80s technology and then a sci-fi book or sci-fi series. And the characters that are in this series are very different from the characters in the original Mistborn series. They're much more like superhero-y, and they really set themselves up as like they have costumes and they have superhero names like the suit and the mask and that sort of stuff. And it's goofy, but it's also really fun. And they also do a whole lot of quipping in the middle of combat. There's a lot of... That's one of the things that Brandon really likes to do, is have these weird little dialogue interactions in the middle of, like, dodging a bullet or whatever. That just makes it kind of silly fun to read. And I'm super excited for tomorrow. I really am. And I will probably read the next book in a matter of days, and we'll be back before the end of the week, and I'll tell you about it. Because they're not hard to read books. They're pretty easy going. The style, the diction, the vocabulary is all very straightforward. And they're not super long books. As compare this to one of his Stormlight books. These are tiny. So, tomorrow, The Lost Metal. Super excited for it. Hopefully... some of you are, and we can talk about it, because I'm really into it. I'm looking forward to reading more. I did read The Way of Kings, which is the first book of the Stormlight Archive, and I did not like it at all. I had really struggled with it, but I am going to go back and read book 2. I'm just not ready for it yet. So, I'm kind of in for the haul, for the 36 book haul of whatever comes out of this crazy setting he has developed. But for nothing else, these are just, both this and the original Mistborn series are just wild fun. Just good books to read. There you go. Mistborn Era 2. We'll see what happens. Thank you for being here as always. Thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, being amazing friends and wonderful people. I really appreciate you. And I'll see you again tomorrow. Today's word you should know to sound smart is omniscient. It is an adjective meaning describes someone who knows everything. The God of love, of omnipotent and omniscient, must be the God of cancer and epilepsy as well. George Bernard Shaw, an Irish playwright. Omniscient, O-M-N-I-S-C-I-E-N-T. There's actually a pretty good... Brandon actually writes a pretty good case for a omniscient God in The Bands of Mourning. There's a pretty good section of dialogue that helps that struggle, and I don't know what I'm trying to say. I guess he explains the God's perspective pretty well, in my opinion.